On the evening of August 10th, 2005, a man in New York City answered the phone at the office where he worked. A woman's voice came across the line, and she asked to speak with one of the man's employees. And the man thought for a second, and then he ultimately replied that actually, that employee had not shown up for their shift that afternoon, and they didn't know why, but they weren't here. And when he said this, he heard a distinct shift in this woman's tone. And she told him in a very trembling voice that she needed to hang up now and call 911. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go hiking with the like button, make sure to secretly replace all the contents from their backpack with garbage. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, August 10th, 2005, 18-year-old Eliza Parsi sat on her bed in her home in Staten Island, New York, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet because Eliza's mother, Seema, was at work. So Eliza had the whole house to herself, at least for a little while, until she herself went to work. Eliza had graduated high school just a few months ago, and now she was working as a clerk at a moving company to try to save up some money for college, and also to eventually move into Manhattan to pursue her dream of working in the fashion industry. However, Eliza did feel a bit guilty about moving away, because it would mean leaving her mom all alone in this big house. And there wasn't really any other family nearby because both of her parents were from Israel. Seema had divorced Eliza's father about 1.5 years ago, and her father had left New York and moved back to Israel. Eliza also had 2 half-brothers who were Seema's sons from her first marriage, and one of them was back in Israel as well, and the other, Eliza's 27-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived just a short drive away in another part of the city. But Eliza and Seema rarely saw him because he was married with a new baby and lived with his in-laws, and so he basically had a whole new family. And also, Raviv had been put in charge of the Parsi family's kosher cookie business, which was really struggling. So he was really busy and always stressed about the company, and he really just didn't make it out to Staten Island very often. Eliza flipped through the last few pages of her magazine and then noticed that it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at work. But first, she wanted to check and see if she had any new messages on her internet dating profiles. So she put her magazine down, went over to her desk, and logged into her computer. So in 2005, internet dating was just starting to take off, and Eliza had made profiles on a few different dating and meetup websites just to see what would happen. And before long, she had found herself messaging and meeting up with men from all around New York City. But she never told her mother about this because she knew that her mother would not approve of Eliza dating men who were not from their same Orthodox Jewish faith. And Eliza knew this for a fact because it's exactly what had happened with her previous boyfriend at the public high school that she went to. Eliza had friends from all different backgrounds, and she had started seriously dating a Muslim boy named Hassan, but her family had really disapproved of their relationship entirely because of his faith. And so eventually, Eliza just couldn't take the family pressure anymore, and she'd broken up with him. And so now, Eliza was much more secretive about her personal life. She would come up with these phony reasons why she was going to other neighborhoods, but really it was just so she could go on dates or hook up with guys for fun without her mom knowing. And also, she had even begun secretly bringing some of them to her house in Staten Island. But she was always very careful to sneak them in through the back door when her mom was at work, so she wouldn't get caught. Now, Eliza logged into her account, and she saw there were a few messages from some guys, and so she responded to them, and then after that, she headed into the bathroom to take a shower before work. And a few minutes later, when Eliza finished her shower and turned off the water, she heard a noise coming from outside the bathroom. Now, she couldn't tell what it was. Earlier that afternoon, she'd heard a landscaping crew working at the house next door with some really loud leaf blowers, but this noise was different. It was like a weird banging sound. So, curious, Eliza got out of the shower, wrapped a towel tightly around herself, and opened the bathroom door to go see what was going on. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, arrived back at the house that she shared with Eliza. She turned her key in the front lock and tried to push the door open, but it would only open a couple of inches because it felt like there was something on the other side that was blocking it from opening any further. Now, Seema had no idea what this could be, and so she just began shoving against the door, and eventually she pushed it open wide enough that she could slip inside. And when she did, the first thing she noticed was that the thing that had been blocking the door was this heavy mirror. But before Seema's mind could really process how this mirror wound up here, she turned on the lights and saw that her living room was absolutely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were flung open, and papers were just strewn everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding because she realized that clearly somebody had broken in and robbed the place. But then her second thought was, where is Eliza? Where's my daughter? Because Seema knew that Eliza had been home at least part of the day, and what if this had happened when Eliza was here all alone? And so Seema began calling out for her daughter, but there was no answer. And so she followed the chaos upstairs and noticed that the door to Eliza's room was closed. So she went over to the door and put her hand on the knob and tried to open it up, but it was locked. And Seema knew that this was just not normal. Eliza never locked this door. And so now, Seema's thinking something has happened here. Something bad has happened here. And so sort of in a panic, Seema just began banging on the door, screaming her daughter's name, hoping she would answer, but it was silent. And so after a couple of seconds, Seema pulled out her phone and called the moving company where her daughter worked. And her stomach dropped when Eliza's boss told her that her daughter had not shown up to work that day. And so with trembling hands, Seema got off that call and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the New York City Police Department drove slowly down a neighborhood street in Staten Island. Ahead, he could see his destination, a 3-story house with yellow crime scene tape across the front yard. But it was hard to get close because the street was now swarming with neighbors and just random people who had come out to see what was going on. So Kenny parked a few houses down and then headed for the house on foot. And when he got there, he was met by 2 patrol officers. And they told Kenny that they had responded to a call about a robbery and then had to break down a door of a locked bedroom where they ultimately found the dead body of 18-year-old Eliza Parsi, who lived in the house with her mother, Seema. The officers explained that when they had checked the rest of the scene, they had noticed that the entire house was basically torn apart. But they hadn't found any signs of forced entry. The officers then directed Kenny's attention over to Seema, who was standing nearby with a small group of people, presumably family or neighbors. Kenny knew he would have to talk to her. But first, he needed to get a better sense of just what was going on inside of this house. So Kenny made his way in the front door and surveyed the living room, where some crime scene techs had already begun processing the scene. The room had definitely been torn apart. But as Kenny looked closer, he could see that a lot of valuable items were sitting untouched and out in the open, like the TV and the stereo, which was unusual for a burglary. Next, Kenny walked up the stairs and into Eliza's room, where more techs were collecting evidence, and the first thing he noticed was that this room also looked ransacked. There were clothes and pillows thrown everywhere, and the mattress had been pulled off the bed frame and was leaning up against the wall. And on the floor in the middle of the room was Eliza's body. She was lying on the ground and she was naked, and there was a towel sort of bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked one of the techs if this is exactly how the body had been found, and the tech said no. When they first got to the scene, Eliza had actually been underneath the mattress and also had a pillow over her face, but they had to move both of those things out of the way in order to actually examine her body, which was why, the mattress was now up against the wall. Kenny knelt down over Eliza's body, but he couldn't see any visible cause of death, like a bullet or knife wounds or bruising, which could mean that maybe she was suffocated. Maybe the pillow that was on her face that they had removed was what was used to kill her. Kenny turned and asked the tech if they had found any evidence of physical injury, and the tech pointed to just a few tiny drops of blood that were on the towel underneath Eliza. Now, they were very small and they could have been old, like maybe somebody had cut themselves shaving, but all these details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, it made Kenny concerned that Eliza might have been a victim of sexual assault before she was killed. So Kenny told the tech to make sure that the blood from the towel, as well as any other bodily fluids they could find, were collected as evidence, because they might belong to Eliza's killer. A few minutes later, Kenny emerged from the house and began walking over to speak with Seema. And Seema, she was crying onto the shoulder of a young man, and the minute this young man saw Kenny, he stepped forward and started demanding to know why the police were keeping them away from Eliza's body, and also why the cops weren't out there arresting his sister's killer. So Kenny just took a deep breath, because this man was obviously Eliza's brother, and it was understandable why he was so upset. Kenny knew that a lot of times grief turned into anger in these situations. So Kenny calmly explained that in order to find Eliza's killer, he first needed information, starting with where he and Seema had been that day. And this got both Raviv and Seema to calm down right away, because they seemed to realize that Kenny might actually be suspicious of them. So the man lowered his voice, and he introduced himself as Raviv, and then he and Seema began answering Kenny's questions. Seema said she'd been at work all day and that there were plenty of coworkers who could say as much, and Raviv explained that he too had been working all day, delivering baked goods all around Long Island. Kenny made notes so he could double-check all their information later. And then he asked if either of them knew anybody who might have had a reason to want to harm Eliza. And Kenny saw them share a very knowing glance. Then Raviv turned to Kenny and said he should look into Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who none of them liked or trusted. And as Kenny started jotting these details down, Seema chimed in and added that her daughter had told her about something really bizarre that Hassan had done recently. Early one morning a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her, like he'd been watching her sleep. And the whole thing had absolutely terrified Eliza because she had no idea how he'd even gotten into the house. She certainly hadn't invited him over, and their house was always locked overnight. And then before Detective Kenny could even ask a follow-up question, Raviv, the brother, just suddenly started yelling, get out, we don't want you here," at somebody across the yard. And so Kenny turned to see who Raviv was yelling at, and he saw this teenage boy standing there, looking completely shocked and scared. And at this point, Raviv went from yelling at Hassan to yelling at Kenny to arrest Hassan, because that was the man who killed Eliza. Late on the night of August 10th, 2005, so just a few hours after the body of 18-year-old Eliza Parsi was found dead in her home in Staten Island, NYPD detective Michael Kenny sat inside of an interrogation room at his precinct. Across from him was Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who had been detained after he showed up at the crime scene. So far, Hassan had been very cooperative and had shared a very detailed timeline of his whereabouts that day. However, he did not have a solid alibi for that afternoon and the early evening, which was likely when Eliza was killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from Hassan, and he also had gotten samples from Eliza's mother and brother at the scene to compare against the blood that had been found on that towel and any other DNA that was found on Eliza's body. But in 2005, DNA and blood evidence took weeks to process. So Kenny was really hoping to just get Hassan to confess right now. So once all his basic questions were out of the way, Kenny decided to test Hassan's truthfulness. And he asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. But Hassan, he didn't deny it. He immediately came clean and admitted to everything. He said that yes, he had previously snuck into her house, and he did sit on Eliza's bed, and he had waited there until she woke up. That was all true. But Hassan insisted that he had not been trying to scare Eliza. He just desperately wanted to talk to her so they could hopefully get back together again. And Hassan had said that when he did that, Eliza hadn't been scared. She was just kind of annoyed, and she had told him that they were broken up for real. And after that, he said he had left without incident. Kenny noticed that in Hassan's version of the story, the way that Eliza reacted to Hassan sitting on her bed, just being kind of annoyed and exasperated about it, was very different than the way Eliza's mother, Seema, had described the same event. She had said that her daughter had basically been scared for her life. So he asked Hassan, why does Eliza's family dislike you so much? Why were they so quick to say you killed Eliza? And Hassan just kind of hung his head and said he didn't think it was about him personally. It was about religion. Hassan was Muslim, and the Parsis were Orthodox Jewish. As Kenny took this in, he wasn't sure which version of the story to believe. Were Hassan and Eliza star-crossed lovers kept apart by her family? Or was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend who couldn't take no for an answer? But regardless, Kenny could not ignore the fact that Hassan had a strong motive and a history of sneaking into Eliza's house uninvited. But Kenny still didn't have a confession from Hassan, nor did he have really any hard evidence at all that would allow him to even hold Hassan. So ultimately, after the interview was over, he told Hassan he was free to go. The next day, Thursday, August 11th, Detective Kenny walked up to a Jewish Orthodox synagogue in Brooklyn, where Eliza's funeral was about to take place. The reason it was happening so quickly was because of the Jewish Orthodox custom that a body must be buried within 24 hours of death. And because of that timeline, it meant that Eliza's autopsy had already been completed. And Kenny had just received the report from the medical examiner, which confirmed that Eliza had died from asphyxiation, likely from being smothered by that pillow. The medical examiner had also found DNA evidence that could be tested against those samples Kenny had collected from the suspects. There were some skin cells under Eliza's fingernails, as well as semen that showed Eliza had sex before she died, probably within 24 hours. And so this evidence made Kenny think that Eliza had been sexually assaulted and had fought back against the person assaulting her, which would explain the skin under her nails. But when Kenny called the medical examiner to voice this theory that he now thought was pretty likely, the medical examiner had actually disagreed, because they didn't find any bruising or bleeding or anything else that indicated sexual violence. And so the autopsy actually concluded that the sex Eliza had before she was killed must have been consensual. But regardless, in Kenny's opinion, the facts of the case so far pointed towards a romantic partner being the killer, which obviously cleared Raviv and Seema and any other family members. And it also did not seem to be some random burglar or home intruder, because Seema had confirmed that nothing in the house was missing. Now, a few of the neighbors had mentioned that there had been some landscapers who had been working at the house next door at the time of her death, and Kenny had managed to track down the crew and question them. But they had all insisted that they had never left the neighbor's yard and that they hadn't seen or heard anything. But just to be sure, Kenny had taken their DNA samples just in case. Now, as Kenny made his way through the crowded sidewalk in front of the synagogue, he could see two distinct groups of people in attendance. There were members of the Orthodox community wearing their long skirts and prayer shawls, and also young people dressed in more modern clothes, who he assumed were Eliza's friends from school. Kenny walked up the front steps and entered the synagogue, and he noticed that the inside of the building was split in half by a wooden partition, almost like a wall, with men on one side and women on the other. So Kenny joined the men's side and stood in the back corner where he could just observe. Kenny noticed Eliza's brother, Raviv, standing near the front, near the casket, and he watched as other men walked up to pay him their respects. The atmosphere was solemn, understandably, and Kenny didn't pick up on any tension or animosity. It just sort of felt like a community coming together to kind of make sense of this tragedy. But then Kenny felt the energy in the room suddenly change, like a switch had flicked, and he could hear people start to whisper to each other very urgently, and everybody's heads turned to look back towards the entrance. Kenny turned his head and looked as well, and he saw this one person who was trying to push through the crowd and make their way up the aisle to the front, where Eliza's casket was. And Kenny realized this person was Hassan. For some reason, he'd shown up again, despite the fact that Eliza's family clearly didn't want him around. And Kenny actually watched as Raviv, who, had seen Hassan, Raviv went straight to Hassan and literally stopped him and shoved him backwards and shouted at him to get out, because they all knew he killed Eliza. Kenny, sensing a physical fight was going to happen here, began pushing his way through the crowd to try to stop them and separate them. But fortunately, before he reached them, other men separated Hassan and Raviv, and then Hassan was escorted out of the building. About 2 weeks later, on August 24, 2005, Detective Kenny was in the office of the NYPD Computer Crime Unit, where the department's IT specialists had begun digging into Eliza's online life. After her funeral, Kenny had spoken to Eliza's school friends, who had told him that Eliza had been trying to move on from her relationship with Hassan, and that she had actually opened accounts on a whole bunch of dating sites that she used to meet guys or sometimes just hook up. And when Kenny had pressed them for more information, the friends had told him that none of those online men were from her tight-knit Orthodox community, which was part of the appeal to Eliza. But it obviously was not something she wanted to share with her mother, so she'd kept it all a big secret from everybody except from her closest friends. Kenny had been able to actually get Eliza's computer with her mother's permission, and had brought some IT specialists on board who were able to dig into Eliza's email and browser history. Now, Kenny watched as the IT specialists directed his attention to one of Eliza's dating site message threads. In this thread, Eliza and a man named Jonathan were making plans for when and where they were going to meet up to have sex. They'd gone back and forth on a few different options until finally, Eliza just said that he should just come over to her house when her mother was at work, and that she would leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in without the neighbors seeing. Kenny saw that this particular hookup was planned for Tuesday, August 9th, 2005, just one day before Eliza was killed. Now, naturally, this made Kenny and the rest of the investigators raise an eyebrow, because this plan of Eliza and Jonathan's, of having him enter secretly through the back door while Seema was at work, matched up exactly with what they had found at the crime scene. In late August of 2005, more than 2 weeks after the murder of Eliza Parsi, NYPD detective Michael Kenny was sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, across from Jonathan Harris, the internet dating match who Eliza had secretly invited to her home the day before she was killed. When Kenny informed the young man that he was here investigating the murder of Eliza Parsi, he noticed that Jonathan didn't seem surprised. But Eliza's murder had been all over local news, and a lot of stories were really exploiting her romantic past and her sex life, so he had probably already heard about what had happened. Kenny asked Jonathan if he had known Eliza, and Jonathan said yes. Then he detailed basically everything that had been planned in that chat message. He said that he had gone to her house, he had snuck in through the back door that was unlocked, and they had had consensual sex. At least Jonathan swore it had been consensual. Jonathan insisted that after that, he had not seen Eliza again, and had never even gone back to Staten Island after that. He then gave Kenny a detailed timeline of where he had been on the day Eliza was killed, and overall, he was a lot more cooperative than Kenny had expected. He even provided a DNA sample without any objection. And so as Kenny left Jonathan's apartment, he was starting to feel a bit worried that this potential big break in the case might actually turn out to be a dead end. Weeks later, on September 13th, 2005, Detective Kenny sat at his desk, reviewing all the information he had gathered about Eliza Parsi's murder. He had checked Jonathan's phone records, also his transit card, and his toll pass, but there was nothing that put him on Staten Island the day of Eliza's murder. And the computer crimes investigators had not turned up any other promising suspects from Eliza's online dating profiles. Detective Kenny had also continued digging into Hassan, but he didn't have enough evidence to either arrest him or clear him. And this was frustrating because Eliza's murder had stayed in the news, and there was a lot of pressure to find the killer, especially from the Orthodox Jewish community, which was significant in New York. It was starting to look like the case had gone cold. Just then, Kenny's phone rang, and when he picked it up, it was the medical examiner who was calling with an update. The results of the DNA analysis were finally in, and the semen sample did not match those skin cells that had been found under Eliza's fingernails. So this meant there was DNA from 2 different people at the crime scene. And when the medical examiner said who each of these samples belonged to, suddenly Detective Kenny knew who killed Eliza. Based on the entire investigation, DNA evidence, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eliza Parsi on the afternoon of August 10th, 2005. Shortly before 2 p.m., the killer approached the back door of the Parsi home where they knew they wouldn't be seen by neighbors. And once they were there, they slowly opened up the door. Once they were inside, they walked all the way through the house right to the front door just to check to make sure it was locked, which it was. And so after that, they went and got a heavy mirror and they moved it and put it in front of the door to block it. The killer knew that both women who lived in this house, Seema and her daughter Eliza, worked during the day. And so the killer didn't expect them to come home. But just in case, they didn't want to take any chances, hence barricading the door. Once they were satisfied with the barricade, the killer got to work, opening drawers and cabinets, looking in every place they could, because they needed something very specific inside of this home that was very valuable. But they couldn't find it anywhere on the bottom floor, which made the killer think it must be in one of the bedrooms upstairs. So the killer climbed the stairs and went into the master bedroom, where they looked through the dresser and in the closet, but they still couldn't find what they were looking for. So the killer left the master bedroom and decided to search the other bedroom next. But when they opened the door to that bedroom, they were shocked to see a young woman coming out of the attached bathroom wrapped in a towel. And from this young woman's reaction on her face, the killer could tell that she knew what they, the killer, were up to. And this enraged the killer because they were sure this woman was going to tell someone what she saw, and it would ruin the killer's plan. After a moment of just shocked silence between the two of them, the young woman opened her mouth like she was about to scream for help. And so the killer instinctively just tackled her to the ground and then grabbed a nearby pillow and pressed it down hard over her face. She scratched and she clawed, trying everything to break free, but the more she fought, the angrier and more emboldened the killer became, and the harder they pressed down, until eventually her body went limp. After that, the killer stood up and they looked down and they saw what they had done, and it caused them to start to panic, because they never meant to kill her, just to scare her and shut her up, but they had obviously gone too far. So, not knowing what to do, the killer just grabbed the pillow and put it over her face, and then also dragged the mattress and put it on top of her body, just so they wouldn't have to look at her. Then, instead of continuing their search for this thing that they wanted inside of this home, they just went downstairs and left out the back door. And they didn't return to the house for hours, not until they received a call from their mother, because the killer was Eliza's half-brother, Raviv. The DNA from the semen that was found at the crime scene belonged to Jonathan, the man that Eliza had consensually had sex with 24 hours before her death. The DNA that was found under Eliza's fingernails belonged to Raviv. It would turn out Eliza's death did not have anything to do with who she was sleeping with. Raviv was angry at their mother because the family business that she had passed along to him didn't make as much money as he had thought it would. And so as a result, Raviv was stuck working all these long hours and also raising his family in his in-laws' basement, which he found totally humiliating. And he knew that Seema had recently come into some money through the sale of a property in connection with her divorce. And Raviv felt like that money was rightfully his, because he had a wife and a child to provide for. But Seema wouldn't give it to him. So instead of driving his typical delivery route on Long Island that day, Raviv went to his mother's house to literally look for the money so he could steal it. But Eliza's work schedule had recently changed, and so he didn't realize Eliza's shift actually started later in the day. And so what was supposed to be a simple robbery turned deadly. Raviv ultimately pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. November 27, 2009, Michael Miller, or Big Mike as pretty much everyone knew him, was stomping around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine, studying his double-wide trailer and thinking through the new addition he was planning. Like his nickname suggested, 47-year-old Big Mike was a huge man, and he had a big bushy beard, and he looked right at home in this desolate rural setting. The trailer stood at the center of a snowy clearing along the edge of dark woods. There were no other buildings in sight, since Big Mike's closest neighbor lived almost 20 miles away. His hometown of Webster Plantation wasn't really a town at all. It had a population of 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and no streetlights. There had never really been much to do there, aside from, creek fishing and taking in the nature, and for a lot of people, working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee there for 29 years, but just 1 week ago, he'd been laid off. The loss of his job had stung, but he wasn't too worried. He and his wife Val lived frugally, and so they had enough cash stowed away to get by until he found another job. Big Mike was just about to head back inside when he heard a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pair of headlights sweep through the trees. Then a familiar white Ford Explorer came into view and pulled up to his mobile home. It was his 2 sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Mike Jr., the oldest son, was like a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike. But Matt was a lot different. He was skinny and pale, with a buzz cut and tattoos along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but was happy for the visit. So he walked up and gave them each a big hug and invited them inside. Then he called out to Val that the boys had stopped by for a visit, and within seconds, his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous coffee cakes in hand. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a birthday tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1. However, Matt still had not told anyone what the party plans were. Matt said they weren't really planning on doing anything, which Val immediately insisted was ridiculous. She said if Matt didn't want to plan something, well, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the party at their place. Matt tried to dissuade her, but finally just caved and agreed to let her host the party as long as it was small. Just immediate family, along with Mike Jr., Matt's girlfriend, as well as Mike Jr.'s best friend, Nate. The three of them were practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself and asked if Big Mike could step outside for a moment. Big Mike's jaw instantly tensed. He could guess where this was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt asked his father if he could borrow some money. Matt began talking about how he hadn't worked in months and was struggling with all the costs of a new baby. He couldn't even afford gifts or a cake for tomorrow. That's why they hadn't planned a party. When he finally finished his spiel, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake. He and Val would be happy to pick one up before the party. But he couldn't lend Matt money at the moment. For one thing, Big Mike told his younger son that he'd himself just been laid off from his job at the mill, so money was tight for him. And more importantly, he couldn't trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, but he did not push the issue. He just shook his head and headed back into the mobile home, where he asked if Mike Jr. was ready to go. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's Ford Explorer. Big Mike watched the SUV disappear into the forest, wondering if he had been too hard on Matt. Then he heard Val calling, and he turned to head back inside. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, so Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of Big Mike and Val's mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the snow toward the trailer. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a neighbor and friend of Big Mike and Val's. Alan had borrowed the gas can from Big Mike a few days earlier, and he was here now to return it. However, when he reached the trailer and knocked on the door, no one responded. Alan tried the door handle and found it was locked. Now, normally, Alan would have assumed that the Millers had just left to run an errand, but he looked and saw both of their vehicles were parked nearby. So he tried knocking again, and when he got no response again, he moved to the nearest window and peered inside. Tilting his head, he was able to make out what appeared to be homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall. There were also paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were getting ready for a party. But just then, he noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor. It took him a moment to realize what he was even looking at, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward. Because Big Mike and Val were both sprawled on the floor beside each other, not moving. Once Alan got over the initial shock, he rapped on the glass and called out to them, but they didn't move at all. Alan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and punched in 911. The moment the dispatcher picked up, Alan told them he'd just discovered the Millers unconscious in their trailer with the door locked. He asked if he should break in and try to help them, but the dispatcher told him that could be dangerous. Whatever caused the Millers to collapse could still be in there, whether it was an electrical problem or a carbon monoxide leak or something else. And so the dispatcher instructed Alan to simply wait until the authorities arrived, which unfortunately would take a while since the nearest police station was over 30 miles away. Alan was still waiting nervously outside the mobile home when he heard sirens approaching through the woods. An ambulance rounded a bend in the trees, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine. And they all pulled up in front of Alan, lights flashing. A police officer wearing a respirator mask told Alan to stand aside, and everyone waited while the firefighters tested the air around the door for carbon monoxide. When they announced that the coast was clear, the police forced open the door and entered the mobile home, followed by a pair of EMTs. And what they found, there in the kitchen, was Big Mike lying flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling, with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His wife Val was slumped by his side, with her head resting on his chest. Their skin was waxy and pale, they weren't breathing, and there was a small amount of blood on the floor around them. The EMTs checked for a pulse to be certain, but it was obvious the Millers were dead. And as soon as the EMTs looked more closely, it became clear what killed the Millers, and it was not carbon monoxide. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple, and a similar one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Alan continued to wait outside, watching the activity from a distance and calling everyone he knew to tell them about his awful discovery. At the same time, local police and medical personnel continued to arrive one by one until an entire fleet of law enforcement vehicles filled the clearing. Finally, about a half an hour after the EMTs first entered the mobile home, lead investigators Daryl Peary and Brian Strout of the Maine State Police arrived. The detectives stepped out of their car, quickly introduced themselves to Alan, and then said they had a few questions for him. They wanted to know how Alan knew the Millers and why he was visiting that morning. He told them about borrowing the gas can and said that Big Mike and Val were some of his favorite neighbors, as good-natured and helpful as you could find. He also mentioned that he'd been surprised to find the door locked when he arrived. People around here typically left their doors unlocked. The detectives collected Alan's contact information and then told him he could leave. After that, they headed inside. Detective Peary's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat everything was. When he got the call for 2 potential deaths at a trailer in the woods, he'd sort of half expected the place to be a cluttered mess, possibly even a drug den or meth lab. Instead, he found a tidy living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. This was a well-cared-for home. A very crowded home at the moment, since police officers were still busy photographing everything in sight. The detectives slipped through the crowd and made their way to the kitchen, where they found the medical examiner crouching over the Millers. Detective Strout leaned down close to examine the bullet hole in Val's right temple. As he did, Peary commented that there wasn't a lot of blood in the kitchen for a pair of gunshot wounds, and the medical examiner agreed, explaining that the murder weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun like a .22. The detectives perked up when they heard this, because they knew such a small gun like a .22 would most likely be used at very close range, and if Big Mike was shot up close from behind, it suggested one of two things. Either he had been held at gunpoint and executed, or he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and then turn his back on them. Just as they were figuring out which was more likely, a police officer hurried over and said they'd just found something the detectives would want to see. Strout and Peary followed this officer to a small room that was full of shelves. They were stocked floor to ceiling with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a small arsenal of firearms. Strout and Peary began walking through the room, pulling out random bins to check on the contents. They couldn't imagine what all this merchandise was doing here. But before they could figure it out, there was a commotion outside. The detectives went back to the living room and looked out the window at a young man in his late 20s flailing his arms in frustration while a sheriff's deputy blocked him from entering the front door. The man kept repeating that he needed to see his mother and father, until finally the deputy just said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man began to sob. Then he stumbled back to his truck, which was parked alongside all the other law enforcement vehicles. By the time the detectives reached the man, he was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, repeatedly trying to call someone on his cell phone. Strout and Peary introduced themselves to the young man, who replied that he was Mike Jr., the Millers' oldest son. They asked him why he had come to his parents' place, and he explained that he just heard from a friend that there was some kind of an accident at his mom and dad's place. And so he had brushed over as fast as he could, but he'd never expected to learn that both of his parents were dead. Mike Jr. said he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother, Matt. Mike wanted to be the one to break the news before Matt heard it from someone else. But unfortunately, Matt wasn't picking up. Now, Mike Jr. set his phone aside and turned to Strout and Peary. He had the look of a man who was in shock. But he said he wanted to help, and then offered to tell them anything they wanted to know. The detectives asked him if there was any reason he could think of that somebody might want to hurt his parents. Mike Jr. said what most people say in this situation right after they lose a loved one. He said his parents were great people and everybody loved them. However, as he said this, a worried look came across his face, and he told the detectives that while his dad had worked at the mill, whenever times got tough, he would supplement his income with a lucrative side hustle, operating a pawn shop and loan shark business right out of his mobile home. He said his father also bought and sold prescription narcotics. The whole operation was unlicensed and totally illegal, but this far from civilization, most people didn't care. Big Mike had a long list of regular customers who would often stop by out of the blue. This information cast the murders in a whole new light for the detectives. Big Mike and Val weren't just some respected couple mysteriously gunned down in their family home. They were the owners of a shady, illegal business that very likely could have turned their trailer into a revolving door of unsavory characters. And the detectives figured Big Mike must have had large amounts of cash on hand to run his loan business. Maybe a desperate individual who did business with Mike saw him as an easy target. Detective Strout was now itching to get back inside the mobile home and verify whether anything was missing. But first, he asked Mike Jr. when he last heard from his parents. Mike Jr. said he'd spoken to his mother around 10 a.m. that morning to firm up details for his niece's birthday party, which Big Mike and Val were supposed to host that afternoon at their mobile home. Mike also said it sounded like his parents weren't alone because when he spoke to her, he heard people talking in the background. And he actually recognized one of the voices as his cousin, a man who was named Clayton Giddon. The detectives made a note that Clayton Giddon could have been the last person to see the Millers alive. After they wrapped up with Mike Jr., Detective Strout called the state police headquarters to try to get background information on Clayton. At the same time, Peary went back inside the trailer. He wanted to get a second look at the storage room where Big Mike had been running his business. And when he got back there and looked around at the cluttered space, it was impossible to say for sure whether anything had been taken. That is, until Peary found an orderly stack of ledgers on a shelf. Flipping through these pages, it quickly became clear that Big Mike had kept meticulous records. Everything he'd bought or sold and every dime he lent was marked and dated. And from the information on these records, Peary could see that a safe where Mike stored jewelry and other high-value items was clearly missing. He also couldn't find one ledger book from the set, which looked like it was the one that was used to track Big Mike's loans. And so Peary was thinking more than ever that robbery had to be the motive for the murders when his partner, Detective Strout, came in to join him. Strout said he had just spoken to the office, who had given him an address for Clayton Giddon, Mike Jr.'s cousin. He was located in the nearby tiny town of Springfield. Strout told his partner that Clayton was apparently an avid hunter, which meant he very likely owned a lot of guns. Now, both detectives were even more eager to talk to him. Later that afternoon, when Strout and Peary knocked on Clayton's door, a young girl answered. She ran to get her father and returned moments later with a man in his mid-30s. Clayton was clearly shaken up, as though he'd already heard the news about his aunt and uncle's deaths. However, when the detectives told him that Big Mike and Val were murdered, Clayton seemed startled. And then he became even more distraught when he realized he was a potential suspect. But Detective Peary promised Clayton they were only there to talk. So Clayton took a few calming breaths, then he invited them into the living room. Clayton told the detectives that he'd driven out to have coffee with his aunt and uncle that morning, and he'd taken his 9-year-old daughter with him. When they arrived at their mobile home around 10 a.m., Big Mike and Val were at ease and looking forward to the birthday party later that day. There was no sign of any trouble, and the couple did not seem like they were in danger. Detective Strout listened patiently, while at the same time studying the man for any sign that he might be lying. But Clayton seemed genuinely shocked, and if his daughter really had been there that morning, Strout had a hard time believing that Clayton was the killer. After all, who could commit murder in front of their own child? But suddenly, Clayton said something that made both detectives lean forward in their seats. He told them that he and his daughter were not the only ones at the Miller's place that morning. When they arrived, Big Mike and Val were already chatting with a young man named Nate Nightingale. Clayton didn't know exactly why Nate was there or what he was doing, but he said he didn't find it that unusual. Nate was Mike Jr.'s best friend, and he hung around the Millers' place all the time. But Clayton said the detectives should still talk to him because when Clayton left the trailer at 10:30 a.m., Nate was still there. Hearing this, Strout and Peary could both feel the case starting to pick up speed. The Millers had been dead for only a matter of hours, but already the detectives had a potential witness who might have been in the room when the murders happened. When the detectives met at the state police office the following day, November 29th, they found new information waiting for them. The autopsy results had come in, and they confirmed that Big Mike and Val were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. This cemented the detectives' suspicions that they'd both been shot at close range, likely right there in their kitchen. The office had also pulled Big Mike's phone records, showing that he'd called a friend at 10:40 a.m. The detectives would contact this friend, and they would confirm that yup, Big Mike had called them, and during their conversation, nothing had seemed off. That left a narrow 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val could have been shot. Big Mike was very much alive at 10:40 a.m., but the couple was dead by 12:44 p.m. when Alan Richardson, the neighbor, had called 911. So Strout and Peary got to work tracking down Nate Nightingale, perhaps the last known person to see the victims alive. But they were also eager to speak with Matt Miller, the younger son of Big Mike and Val, who still was not answering his phone. And as they would find out, Nate Nightingale and Matt lived right near each other. So the detectives set out to pay them each a visit. Matt's apartment was closer to the station, so Strout and Peary headed there first. And from the moment Matt answered the door, the detectives could sense that something was just off. The 26-year-old had shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But it was actually Matt's behavior, not his appearance, that really got their attention. Matt was not acting like someone who just lost his parents. He didn't show signs of grief or even press the detectives for any details on the progress of the case. Instead, he seemed nervous and evasive, almost like he just wanted Strout and Peary to leave as soon as possible. And the detectives responded to this behavior by actually pressing him on his whereabouts the previous day. He told them he had just been driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya and their infant daughter, picking up last-minute items for the birthday party that afternoon. Matt's alibi was short on details, and the way Matt refused to meet their eyes as he spoke made the detectives even more suspicious. And also, Tanya was out running errands with the baby, so she couldn't even confirm Matt's story. Strout felt sure that Matt must be hiding something, so he tried asking about his relationship with Big Mike and Val. Was he on good terms with his parents? Matt brushed the question off, saying of course he was on fine terms with them. They were his parents. And then after that, no matter what the detectives asked, Matt gave similarly curt responses. It eventually became clear the detectives were not going to get much more from him today. So they got a cell phone number for Matt's girlfriend, Tanya, and told him they'd follow up soon. And then they left to go talk to the next person on their list, Nate Nightingale. After their interview with Matt, speaking to Nate was like a breath of fresh air. From the moment Nate answered the door, he was polite and eager to help. Nate was clearly upset and told the detectives that he'd been close to the Millers for years. He had been best friends with Mike Jr. since high school, and he considered the Millers' trailer like his second home. Detective Peary asked Nate what he had been doing at the Millers' trailer on the morning of their murders. Nate said that he dropped by to catch up and also to take out a small loan from Big Mike. They'd just wrapped up business when Big Mike's nephew, Clayton Giddon, had arrived with his daughter. Nate said that Clayton left at 10:30, and then Big Mike took a phone call shortly after that. And then after Mike got off the phone, Nate said his goodbyes. To this point, Nate's story about what happened that morning matched all the details the detectives already knew from speaking to Clayton and also looking over Big Mike's phone records. But then, Nate revealed something they had not expected. Nate said that as he was leaving, a woman arrived at the Millers' trailer. He said he'd never seen her before, but she looked like she was in her 50s, maybe around 5'4" tall, with a slender build and glasses and bangs. He said she had called out, "Hi, Val," as she entered the mobile home, and she greeted Nate as he was leaving. His best guess was that she was a customer, but she could have just been a friend. At that point, Nate said he drove off to meet up with his girlfriend, so he didn't know how long that woman had stayed at the trailer. The detectives got the feeling like things were speeding up again. They now had someone who was at the trailer during the 2-hour window when the shooting occurred. The detectives knew they had to speak to this woman, but they had to find her first. Strout and Peary told Nate that a department sketch artist would be in touch very soon to put together a sketch of this mysterious woman. And sure enough, by the time the two detectives were back at the office, they found that the artist and Nate had already linked up, and the sketch was complete. Looking at the sketch, the detectives thought this woman looked like she could be anyone. But there weren't a lot of people in this part of Maine to begin with, so if this woman was a local, there was a decent chance somebody would recognize her. On December 1st, 2009, so 3 days after the Millers' murder, the detectives hosted a press conference where they officially disclosed what many people already knew. The Millers' deaths had been ruled a double homicide. Then, they also released the forensic sketch of the mystery woman, saying she was an important person of interest in the case. Anyone who recognized her was encouraged to call the investigators as soon as possible. Right after the press conference, police posted copies of the sketch all over town, while others went door to door asking if anyone knew the woman. And soon, calls started to come from people all around the state who said they did recognize her. The detectives were just starting to look into these tips when Matt Miller's girlfriend, Tanya, finally returned their call from 2 days ago. They asked her where Matt had been on the morning of the murders, wondering if she would confirm Matt's claim that she'd spent the morning driving around with him looking for gifts. But instead, Tanya insisted she had not been with Matt at all that morning. She said on Saturday morning, Matt had walked out the door without saying where he was going. And for the next 2 hours, nobody could reach him, which was extremely frustrating considering they were supposed to be getting ready for their daughter's birthday party that afternoon. She said he finally returned around noon, but refused to say where he'd been. The detectives were astonished. Matt had clearly lied to them, and his own girlfriend was now saying that she herself didn't know where Matt was during the time of the murders. They considered driving over to pick Matt up for questioning, but decided to hold off until they could gather more information. The detectives already knew Matt had a criminal record. There was an outstanding arrest warrant out for him for writing bad checks. But now, Strout and Peary wondered if he might be involved in more illegal activity. For the next 3 days, the detectives quietly contacted people throughout the area, pressing for information about Matt. And what they learned was that Matt was clearly addicted to prescription drugs and had recently begun selling personal items, including his own Xbox, so he could buy more. And Matt's older brother, Mike Jr., had told them that Matt had asked his father for a loan on the night before the murders, when the brothers had dropped by. Big Mike had apparently turned him down, most likely because he knew Matt would simply blow the money on drugs. But the most damning tip of all didn't have anything to do with Matt's addiction or his criminal past. A local resident told the detectives they'd seen Matt's white Ford Explorer in the vicinity of his parents' house on the morning of the murders. This was something Matt had never disclosed to the police, and it potentially put him at the scene during the 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val were murdered. At this point, Strout and Peary knew it was time to talk to Matt again. They were not quite ready to charge him with his parents' murders, but the facts were quickly stacking up against him. So on December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on that outstanding bounced check charge and brought him in for questioning. Once they put him in a room, they pushed him hard, telling him they knew he killed his parents. And Matt just denied everything, while at the same time becoming increasingly emotional. But after hours of intense interrogation, Matt stuck to his story that he never would hurt his parents, and even the detectives started to wonder if they had it wrong. So they ultimately sent Matt back to a holding cell and then stepped out of the interview room to regroup. And that's when they got a tip that reassured them they were on the right track. A local man called to say that on the evening before Big Mike and Val were killed, Matt had called him up looking to buy a gun. He even specified he wanted a .22 caliber pistol, which, according to the autopsy, was the type of gun used to commit the murders. The man said the firearms sale had not gone through, But the detectives figured Matt still could have kept on looking and eventually gotten his hands on a .22. With this new tip, the detectives marched back into the holding cell where Matt sat on his bed and told him what they'd learned. Matt immediately insisted that the tip was false, saying he never tried to buy a gun that night. But the stress of the interrogation was clearly wearing on him, and finally he broke down and confessed. Not to murdering his parents, but to lying about his alibi. He said that on the morning of the murders, he was meeting with a drug dealer not far from his parents' place. He bought some pills and then went into the woods to take them. He later lied about it because he didn't want to incriminate himself and because he was ashamed that he was off getting high while he was supposed to be getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. Strout and Peary were skeptical of Matt's tearful confession, especially after all the lies, but they agreed to check out his new alibi and see if there was any truth to it. The detectives began by pulling security camera footage from businesses along the route Matt said he took. It was a very tedious process that took 2 full days, as the detectives scrubbed hours of footage looking for Matt's white Ford Explorer. Strout's eyes were starting to glaze over when Peary suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pointed at the screen. The footage showed a familiar car traveling away from the Miller's place at 11:25 a.m. on November 28th, the morning of the murders. The detectives stared at the grainy footage, slowly realizing what this meant. The footage conclusively showed that the car's driver had lied about their alibi and had been close to the trailer around the time the crime was committed. Strout and Peary leapt into action. They sent officers out to bring that driver in for questioning. But before the arrest warrant could ever be drawn up, Peary's phone rang. He answered it, and there was a woman on the line. Peary did not recognize her voice, but she told him she had vital information about the Miller's case. For a moment, Peary was ready to write this off as just another bad tip. He and Strout had been fielding calls all week from people who claimed to recognize the mystery woman from the forensic sketch, and every one of those calls had been a dead end. But this one was different. The caller didn't mention the mystery woman at all. Instead, she said she actually knew who killed Big Mike and Val. And as the detectives listened to her story, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, security camera footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael and Valerie Miller on the morning of November 28, 2009. Early that morning, the killer was home in their apartment, rifling through drawers in search of something, anything, that they could quickly turn into cash. They'd already pawned or sold their video game console, DVD player, and sound system, along with pretty much everything else of value. Now they were broke again and getting desperate. Suddenly, their hand closed around a metal grip. They pulled the object from the drawer, and they felt a rush of exhilaration as they stared down at the .22 caliber pistol in their hand. It wasn't what they'd initially planned to sell, but this gun could get them all the cash they needed. A few hours later, the killer was standing in the Miller's mobile home, talking to Big Mike in the kitchen. After their desperate morning search, the killer finally felt calm. Finally, the conversation with Big Mike moved past chit-chat to business. The killer pulled the pistol from their jacket and held it out, asking how much Big Mike could offer for it. The killer wasn't here to shoot Big Mike. They had come to pawn the gun. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, then gave his answer. The killer blinked, then shrugged and nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It was less than they had hoped for, but probably a fair offer for the tiny pistol. Big Mike handed the gun back over and said he would need to grab his business ledger from the storage room, and then he turned, but before Mike took a single step, the killer's finger brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Big Mike's examination, and the gun went off. The killer jumped from surprise as Big Mike collapsed, his enormous body slumping to the floor of the kitchen. Val screamed and rushed into the room, instantly dropping to her husband's side. In an instant, the killer realized what they'd just done. They had shot Big Mike in the head. Maybe Val would believe this was an accident. Maybe she wouldn't. But right now, all the killer wanted was for her screaming to stop. Without really understanding why, the killer raised the gun and fired, this time on purpose. Val's scream was cut short as a bullet hit her in the head, and she collapsed onto her husband. The killer just stared down at the crumpled bodies, horrified by what they'd just done. The situation felt so unreal, but as the seconds ticked by and Big Mike and Val didn't move, the killer knew they were dead. Then, the killer realized that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would need to get out of the mobile home right now. And they were about to flee when a thought suddenly struck them. They came here for money, and Big Mike would not be needing money anymore. Besides, it might be good for the killer if the police thought the shooting was part of a robbery. So, the killer ran for the storage room. They threw the door open and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the guns and electronics. The killer knew they couldn't carry very much, so they decided to take the safe. Before leaving, the killer stopped to consider Big Mike's business ledgers. They knew these books would include the sizable loans the killer had taken out from him in the past. This made the killer nervous. So the killer quickly flipped through the pages of the ledger books until they found one containing their own name. They tucked that ledger under their arm, picked up the small but heavy safe, and left the storage room. They avoided looking at the bodies on the kitchen floor as they shuffled past, and they just continued to drag the safe out of the mobile home back to their car. Before leaving, they doubled back to lock the trailer's door. With any luck, that would delay the bodies from being discovered, and hopefully buy the killer a bit more time. A few minutes later, the killer was speeding away, and they were so focused on just getting out of town that they didn't notice the closed-circuit cameras aimed at the road. When Detective Strout and Detective Peary reviewed the camera footage 2 weeks later, they didn't see the white Ford Explorer they were looking for, because Matt Miller was not the killer. It was Nate Nightingale, the best friend of Mike Jr., who the Millers had treated almost like a third son. The woman who had called in with a hot tip was Nate's girlfriend, and she told Strout and Peary that Nate had come to her and confessed to the crime. Nate was arrested on December 12th, and shortly after that, he would admit to everything. He said he really had gone to the Miller's place intending to pawn the gun. He needed the money so he could go Christmas shopping with his girlfriend. But while he was showing the gun to Big Mike, it went off by mistake, and when he realized what he had done, he panicked and intentionally killed Val. Nate also admitted to fabricating the story about the mystery woman. He said she was just a red herring to keep the police off his tail. She didn't exist. Detective Strout and Peary didn't like to admit this, but Nate's ploy almost worked. The search for that mystery woman burned up a lot of their time, and if they hadn't stumbled upon the security camera footage of Nate's car, it might have saved him. But now that they knew the truth, they looked at the forensic illustration again, and they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the sketch looked shockingly similar to Nate Nightingale himself, down to the narrow face, thin nose, and glasses. Nate had intended to throw the police off his trail with this mystery woman, but as he gave them details for the sketch, he sort of subconsciously wound up describing himself. It was almost like his guilt over murdering the people who helped raise him was so great, he could not let himself get away with it. Nate was sentenced to 40 years in prison for murdering Val. Big Mike's death was treated as manslaughter, for which Nate received 15 years to be served concurrently. Big Mike and Val's sons, Mike Jr. and Matt, sat stone-faced at the sentencing, while Nate tearfully apologized for destroying their family. Neither brother responded, but they stayed and watched while he was led away in handcuffs. Ever since, the two brothers have celebrated Matt's daughter's birthday a week early, so that on November 28th, they can also remember their parents. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, And there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. On the evening of January 3rd, 1991, a 40-year-old mountain climber named Zhi Song felt the wind and snow whipping against his face as he stared up at a mountain peak jutting through the clouds high above him. Zhi was standing more than 2/3 of the way up a mountain called Kawa, which is the highest mountain in the Meilan Snow Mountain Range in southwest China. Kawa stands at an elevation of about 22,000 feet, which is more than 4 miles, and nobody in recorded history had ever reached its peak. In fact, the Tibetan villagers who lived at the base of this mountain believed that nobody ever would, and some of those villagers regularly tried to prevent would-be climbers from even trying. But Zhi and the 17-member team of climbers he was helping to lead were determined to prove the villagers wrong, and to make history. They had started climbing this mountain a month earlier, and they were now closer to the peak of Kawa than anyone had ever gotten. Zhi turned his gaze away from the peak and looked around the temporary camp where he and his team were planning to spend the night. He could see several climbers struggling to reinforce their tents against the snow and the wind. He and his team had chosen to climb at this time of year because it was known as the dry season, when major storms were actually rare. So Zhi couldn't understand why the snow just kept coming down. He grabbed his radio off his belt and called down to base camp, which was a camp at the foot of the mountain where other members of the team provided weather information and support to the climbers. Zhi told a base camp team member that the snow was still unbelievably falling hard up here. That team member reminded him that the climbers should clear snow away from their tents at least every 2 hours. Zhi was about to respond, but just then, his radio cut out, and he heard this loud buzzing sound coming from it. He stared down at his radio, confused. This was the sound it made when it needed a new battery, but he had just put a new battery in. Zhi fumbled with the radio, trying to fix it, but all he could hear was this buzzing sound, and then also, periodically, he'd hear the voice of the base camp team member cutting in and out. Zhi communicated over the radio and wasn't sure if anyone heard it, but he said he was losing communication and he would try to contact them again later. Then Zhi turned off his radio, clipped it to his belt, and the buzzing stopped. As the sun finished setting, the wind picked up even more. Zhi craned his neck upwards again, and he saw that the peak of Kawa had now disappeared in the snow and the darkness. Zhi had done lots of difficult climbs in the past, and he was sort of used to running into problems right when he thought he was about to achieve his goals. That was just how mountains worked. All the planning in the world could not prepare climbers for everything. But for some reason, this felt different. This storm just didn't show any signs that it would ever let up. Zhi lowered his head and walked towards a group of tents. He wanted to help his team clear snow away. But all of a sudden, Zhi heard screaming coming from inside one of these tents. He and several other climbers moved as quickly as they could through the snow toward the sound. They stepped into the tent, and they saw a woman laying in her sleeping bag, and she was shivering uncontrollably, and sweat was running down her forehead. Zhi knew this woman, who was one of several Japanese climbers on their team, had been dealing with a high fever for days. But now, she didn't just look sick, she looked terrified. As soon as Zhi entered the tent, the woman stopped screaming, and she just started muttering. Zhi knew some Japanese, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He looked around the tent, and he could tell that the other Japanese climbers who had come in were also confused by the woman's words. Zhi turned to one of them and asked, what is she saying? And in a little more than a whisper, the climber told Zhi the woman was saying, "Something is coming." Later that night, the storm began to reach blizzard conditions as Zhi made his way around the camp, checking on his team. As bad as the weather had gotten, and as alarming as the screaming Japanese woman had been, Zhi refused to panic. He believed if everyone just stayed calm and prepared, they could make it through the night. But he quickly realized he was the only one who felt this way. Each climber Zhi spoke to seemed as frightened as the woman with the fever. He tried his best to calm everyone down he spoke to, but nothing he did seemed to work. So eventually, he headed back towards his own tent to make sure it was secure. But before he got there, he heard more shouting. At first, Zhi assumed it was the woman with the fever, but he listened more closely and he could tell it couldn't be, because it was a man's voice. Zhi trudged back through the snow towards this shouting man's tent to see what was wrong, and when he stepped inside, Zhi felt truly scared for the first time since he'd come to the mountain. Inside the tent, Zhi saw one of the climbers sitting by a fire, pen and notebook clutched in his hands, and on his face was this wild look. His eyes were darting from one side of the tent to the other, and he would shout at something only he could see and hear. And then he would scribble furiously in his notebook. It was like he had lost his mind. Zhi was so unsettled that he just backed out of the tent, and as soon as he was outside, he turned and began rushing back through the snow towards his tent. However, as he was between tents, he heard this loud rumbling sound, almost like the banging of a drum, coming from high up the mountain. He froze where he was, terrified, and he heard the sound of trees cracking and splitting, and he knew this must be it. This is the avalanche. However, when Zhi looked up the mountain, expecting to see a mass of ice and rock barreling down the mountain towards them, all he could see was the falling snow and the black night sky. There was no avalanche. Early the next morning, January 4th, the snowstorm subsided, and the weather on Kawagabawa turned calm and sunny. A team leader down at base camp radioed up to Zhi to see how the climbers fared over the night, but Zhi didn't respond. So the team leader tried radioing the other members of the team that were up there with Zhi as well, but they too didn't respond. And so this team leader sent out a small search team to see if they could get a visual of Zhi and the other climbers he was with. However, remember, these climbers were thousands of feet up the mountain from base camp. So under the best of circumstances, it would have been really hard to look up and have seen them. And these were certainly not the best circumstances. There had been this huge snowstorm over the night, a snowstorm that really wasn't even supposed to happen this time of the year, which made getting a visual on Zhi and his team nearly impossible. And so this team leader quickly realized that if the climbers had gotten lost up on the mountain, he didn't have the resources to mount an effective search. So he quickly informed multiple government agencies that his team was missing, and then the government took over. That day, the Chinese government launched a massive operation on Kawagabawa. Professional search and rescue teams worked with volunteers on the ground, and airplane and helicopter pilots circled the mountain. But after 2 weeks of this daily intense searching, it became clear Zhi and the rest of the climbers, along with any remnants of their camp, had disappeared. On January 22nd, so 18 days after the climbers had gone missing, rescuers abandoned the search, and the government issued an official statement. The statement said that while massive snowstorms were indeed rare for this time of the year, they were not actually impossible to occur. So officials said the storm likely caused an avalanche that wiped out the camp and buried the climbers somewhere they couldn't be found. Now, this explanation was very logical, and for most people, it marked the end of this very tragic story. But not for the villagers who lived at the base of Kawagabawa. These villagers, who didn't think anyone would ever summit the mountain, and who actively tried to stop those that did, they did not believe the official statement. They had a story of their own, which they were certain was the real explanation for what had happened to the climbers. And when the government issued its statement, these villagers tried to tell people that the government was wrong. And so, when climbers and tourists from all over came to Kawagabawa, these villagers told them what they believed actually happened, and how it would happen all over again if anyone tried to reach the mountain's peak. Now, most people dismissed the villagers' story as rumor or superstition, and that was a reasonable way to react to this, until 7 years later, when 3 shepherds from the village made a terrible discovery. Seven years later, on the afternoon of June 18, 1998, 3 shepherds were walking along a glacier near the base of Kawagabawa. This glacier was 2.5 miles away from where Zhi and the rest of his climbers had set up their final camp. But the shepherds were not there to do any kind of search. This glacier was located near their village, and it was home to a temple that they often visited. So they were talking and walking towards the temple when, just up ahead of them, one of the shepherds spotted something bright and colorful sticking up out of the ice. The group was intrigued, and they began walking towards it, thinking it might be a prayer flag. But as they got closer, and this colorful object came into focus, the group went quiet. And then the shepherds also saw there were other colored objects just like this one scattered around the area. These objects were the bodies of the climbers who had disappeared from Kawagaboa 7 years earlier, still wrapped in the colorful coats they'd been wearing when they headed up the mountain. But what the shepherds could not have known in this moment was that buried under the ice with the bodies was a diary, which one of the climbers had used to record the events of the ascent. It belonged to the climber that Zhi had seen shouting at an unseen force and scribbling furiously on the night they all vanished. And this diary would reveal that the stories the villagers told about Kawagaboa and the lost climbers were more than just legend. It would turn out there was a very specific reason why these Tibetan villagers believed nobody would ever reach the peak of Kawagaboa. It was because the peak was said to be a sacred place. It was the home of a warrior protector god, and because of this, it was not meant for human beings to climb. The villagers believed that if anyone ever approached the peak, it would wake the spirits of the mountain, and the mountain god would punish them. This punishment would lead to death, but it would not stop there, because the dead would become prisoners of the mountain for 7 years. And these villagers had made their beliefs very clear to Zhi and the rest of his team of climbers who wanted to be the first people to ever reach Kawagaboa's peak. In fact, a group of villagers had heavily protested their climb and warned the climbers that their expedition would anger the mountain god and result in tragedy. But Zhi and the rest of his climbers had not heeded their warnings. The diary of the climber that was discovered along with the bodies recounted what happened as a result. The diary started like a lot of climbing diaries do, an account of the day's hike, the scenery, the weather. But as the dates got closer to the night the climbers disappeared, the diary took a strange turn. The writer became obsessed with these shadows he saw walking across his tent, and he said he heard women laughing and babies crying all around him in the darkness. That woman who had screamed out, who was sick with a fever, had said she felt something bad was coming, and she had tried to warn the others. But by the time Zhi heard the sound like beating drums high up on the mountain that he thought was an avalanche, like many thought was an avalanche, the mountain god had apparently already unleashed his wrath. As soon as Zhi and those climbers had disappeared, the villagers all assumed that they had faced the wrath of the mountain god. But the fact that their bodies had remained hidden for 7 years, the length of time the mountain god keeps the dead imprisoned in the mountain, was all the proof the villagers needed to know they were right. And the climber who wrote the diary ended up believing them too, although it was too late. In his final diary entry, he wrote, quote, "We were wrong. They are coming. Run." In 2001, 10 years after the climbers had died on the mountain, the Chinese government banned all mountain climbing activities in the Meilin snow mountain range. To this day, still, nobody on record has ever actually set foot on the peak of Kawagaboa. Our next story is called Something in the Bushes. On a June day in 1953, a 31-year-old American doctor named George Moore stood in a small mountain campsite in Nepal, staring out at a massive rainstorm forming on the horizon. George had been in Nepal, which is a country south of China, for 8 months, leading a small medical team trying to stop the spread of diseases like malaria in villages all across the region. This was groundbreaking work in 1953, and it was starting to make George famous back home in America. And here in Nepal, He had already become a trusted figure among the villagers, many of whom had never seen a person from the West until they met George. But right now, a group of these villagers were scrambling to get George out of their village. And this was because of the storm that George was looking at. One of the villagers pointed at the clouds and told George this was not a regular thunderstorm. The monsoons were coming. And once the monsoons hit, the only dirt road that led back to George's base in the city of Kathmandu would flood very quickly. And the horrendous rains could last for months, which meant if George wanted to continue his work stopping disease in other parts of this region, he would have to get out right now. George had known the monsoon season was coming, but it had arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, and so he and his team were sort of caught off guard. The journey out of the village was not something they wanted to undertake suddenly with so little preparation, because they didn't have a car. They literally had to walk out, and so they needed to be fully prepared. And also, this dirt road out of the village went through a deep forest where the locals claimed it was inhabited by terrible monsters. Now, while George did not believe in the supernatural, he did think that, fantastical stories about monsters often started because of real-life animal attacks. And so, monsters or not, the forest was definitely dangerous, especially since they again would be on foot. But George knew they really didn't have any other choice. They did have to go right now. George quickly gathered up first aid kits, medicine, and supplies and put them into a large pack. Then he reached down, pulled a revolver out of the holster on his hip, and spun the chamber to make sure the gun was fully loaded. And when he saw all 6 bullets, he knew he was as ready as he was going to be. George holstered his gun, thanked the villagers for their help, and then turned to lead his team out. But as he stepped onto the road, one of the villagers grabbed his arm to stop him. Then they pointed towards a spot on the mountain above the road that George and his team needed to take, and George looked up and saw large billows of smoke rising above the trees and into the sky. In a strained voice, the villager told him that no matter what, George and his team must not go anywhere near where that smoke was. The storm continued to move in as George and his team began their journey. The men were getting wet and muddy, and the thunder was so loud it made their bodies feel like they were vibrating. But the rain really was not their biggest problem. Because by the time they had gotten maybe a mile or so from the village, a thick fog had rolled in and covered the entire road. And then suddenly, it was like the fog got so intense that George couldn't even see his team anymore. George did his best to try to walk as straight as he could, doing his best to stay on the road, but the fog at this point was so intense, he couldn't even see the ground, so he didn't even know if he was on the road. And then in the back of his head, he couldn't help but have this fear that because he didn't know where he was going and couldn't see his team, that he would unwittingly walk over to the place where that smoke was coming from. But he reassured himself that that couldn't possibly happen because the smoke looked really far away when they had set out, and this fog had only really rolled in for the last couple of minutes, so there's no way he could have gone all the way over there. But as George stumbled along, bumping into trees and feeling totally disoriented, the fog only seemed to grow thicker. The sound of the wind and the rain swirled around him, and George started to feel really disoriented, like he was in a dream or something. Then this horrific shriek cut through the pounding of the rain and the howling of the wind. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a wild animal, although George had no idea what kind it was. But George didn't need to know what this animal was to know it was a threat, and he needed to get away from it fast. So he turned and just began hustling in the direction away from the sound. But again, he could barely see. He was bumping into trees, he was stumbling on rocks. At this point, he knew he was well off the dirt road, but had no way of getting back to it. He didn't know where his team was, he called out to them, but didn't hear back. I mean, he's totally panicking at this point. And after a few minutes of trekking away from that shrieking sound, suddenly something huge and dark loomed up in front of George. For a second, he flinched, like somehow that shrieking animal had paced around him and now was stopping his way. But then he realized what he was seeing was actually this huge boulder. Frantically, he began climbing the boulder, thinking if he got to higher ground, he'd be safe from whatever was shrieking behind him. and as George climbed, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a member of his team. It was an entomologist. And amazingly, he was right behind George, standing at the base of the boulder. George just hadn't seen or heard him. The entomologist also seemed panicked and began climbing as well, and while he did, he shouted to George that he just heard movement coming from the plants. And so whatever animal was out here that this entomologist had also heard was clearly close by. George and the entomologist made it to the top of the boulder. They stood there, shivering and muddy, still surrounded by fog. George could feel his heart pounding, but he tried to hold his breath and not make a sound. The two men listened, trying desperately to hear any sign of this creature that had shrieked. But there was no more sound. It was silent. But seconds later, the men heard a new sound. It was like something was moving quickly through nearby bushes down below the boulder. George and the entomologist crouched down, trying desperately to see what was down there. And as they did, they saw the shadow run through the fog. On instinct, George put his hand on the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw, and now neither of the men moved a muscle. Then another noise came from the fog. George thought it sounded like grunts and teeth chattering. For a second, everything fell silent again. Then George heard heavy footsteps nearby. He started to shake with fear, but at the same time, he was desperate to see what was coming. So he leaned forward over the boulder as much as he could, trying to look down to see what this thing was. And suddenly, through the fog, he saw a pair of bright yellow eyes staring right back up at him. George tried to get back up, but it was like he was frozen. He just crouched there staring at the eyes in the fog. And slowly, he saw more pairs of yellow eyes appear in the fog. And he saw shadows of what looked like long tails whipping back and forth. Instantly, George thought of the monsters from the villagers' stories. But he told himself that's ridiculous. These were clearly just langur monkeys. He reminded himself that he was a doctor, a scientist. There had to be a rational explanation. These were just animals. They couldn't be monsters. But then one of these creatures moved forward and put its claw on the boulder and began to climb up. And at this point, George finally got a clear look at it. He saw this thing stood at least 5 feet tall, much bigger than any of the langur monkeys or any other monkeys that inhabited this forest. And instead of fur, it had gray skin. But most terrifying was its mouth, which was unnaturally large, stretching almost from ear to ear. And it was filled with these sharp teeth, the same color as its eyes. And as this creature slowly began to ascend the boulder, George felt a level of fear he had never experienced. Something primitive from deep down inside of him. A single terrifying thought blared in his mind. These creatures are not of the natural world. These creatures are godly. Now George screamed and drew his gun. He was too afraid to aim it at the creatures directly, so he pointed it up into the air and began shooting. The creatures let out a chorus of these horrible shrieks, the same shrieks they had heard earlier. Then he watched as the creatures turned, and their shadows and their yellow eyes disappeared back into the fog. George and the entomologist stayed huddled on top of that boulder, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. Those creatures did not come back, and eventually, the rest of George's team found him and the entomologist. The two men scrambled down from the boulder, and they joined the group. The team asked them what happened. They said that, George and the entomologist had gotten too far ahead of them in the fog and they'd lost them. Then they heard the gunshots. But all George could say was, "We have to get out of here right now. I will explain later." And as the team set off again, George took a second and turned back around and looked in the direction of the boulder, where he and the entomologist had seen these creatures. And now that he had a little more perspective and the fog had cleared just a little bit, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. That column of smoke that he had been warned not to go anywhere near was coming up right from behind the boulder. He and the entomologist accidentally fled to the exact spot they were told not to go. That night, after a long hike, George and his team finally made it to their base. And it was only when he was back in the safety of his camp, with friendly villagers all around him, that George was able to finally think clearly again about what he had just experienced. with the strange creatures in that place where the smoke was. He didn't know what to make of it. George was a United States Army veteran and a man of science. He didn't believe in monsters or terrible gods roaming the forests. But he told his story as accurately as he could to the villagers, hoping they would have some realistic explanation for what the creatures were. But what the villagers had to say only left George feeling even more unsettled. So, George decided he was just not going to speak of what he had seen to anyone anymore. He had a bright future ahead of him as a doctor. He wasn't going to throw it away by making himself look crazy. And so when he got to America, and people asked him about his time in Nepal, he would tell them a wild story about this chance run-in with a group of langur monkeys. But the true memory of the creatures he actually saw out there, which were not langur monkeys, at least not to him, never left George. Their height, their yellow eyes, their huge mouths and sharp teeth, and the pure fear George had felt in their presence. George was a man of science, which made him want to forget this encounter. But he was also a man of truth, and so after spending years with these memories in his head, George came to believe that he had a duty to tell the truth about what he actually saw, no matter what the consequences were. And so in 1957, 4 years after his encounter in Nepal, Dr. George Moore published a first-hand account of what he had seen in a magazine article that was titled, "I Met the Abominable Snowman." In this article, he explained that the place on the mountain where the smoke was rising, where the villagers warned George not to enter, was called the House of the Gods. And the House of the Gods was home to the Yeti. A Yeti is an ape-like creature said to live in the Himalayas, and is similar to Bigfoot, but thought to be a bit shorter. In the West, the Yeti is often referred to as the Abominable Snowman. And in his article, George said he'd come face to face with a pack of them in Nepal. Telling the world what he'd seen did not adversely affect George like he'd feared. He went on to have a long, successful career and is still considered a pioneer in the field of medical outreach. And because of George's standing as a doctor and researcher, his encounter in Nepal has remained one of the most highly credible cryptid sightings in modern history. And so, as much as some explorers and scientists might think we can fully understand the natural world, both of these stories are proof that you can't. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.